Hey guys, welcome to Module 2 short lecture. Now this week we're going to be talking about a couple different things, and we're going to be focusing on some of the early roots of our law enforcement system here in the United States. Talk a little bit about Peel, Sir Robert Peel, and then I want to spend a little bit more time talking about the rule of law and how it applies in our criminal justice system, because that's going to be an important part of some of your future writing assignments. So again, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the English and colonial roots to policing in the U.S., a little bit about Sir Robert Peel and the influence on policing in the United Kingdom and the U.S., and specifically London, the eras of policing in the U.S., and again, a little bit more about the rule of law. So some of the concepts that we got that have English and or colonial roots are the sheriff, the constable, the coroner, and the justice of the peace. Now, the sheriff is the chief law enforcement officer of a county, normally elected and frequently operating the jail as well as law enforcement functions here in the United States. First sheriffs in America appeared in early colonial period, and the sheriff's concept came from England. They called them the Shire Reef. And so that concept was transferred over to the U.S. when we colonized and shortened it to the idea of the sheriff. All right. The constable in England favored noblemen who were forerunners of modern day U.S. criminal justice functionaries. These type of positions largely disappeared in the United States by the 1970s, although you may still find the title of constable in some states, maybe such as Texas, Louisiana. I think you'll find them mostly in the South. This office, the idea of the constable, originally began during the reign of Edward I in England. Now, next we have the idea of the coroner, an early English court officer. Today, it's usually a physician in the United States whose duty it is to determine the cause of death. Now, a coroner was elected from the beginning, but that later changed. Now, oftentimes, the coroner is, in most jurisdictions, now the sheriff. So, for example, it's sheriff / coroner. So now the sheriff, which is an elected official, is now serving both functions as a sheriff and a coroner. In some counties, the coroner may be a separate office, but just know that there is a level of politics associated with that in terms of one seeking the office or being elected. Many of you probably heard of a coroner's inquest, which is used to determine the cause of death and the party responsible for it. The coroner can serve as a sheriff, which I just briefly mentioned, if the elected sheriff is disabled or disqualified. And that's when you have the two separate entities, the sheriff and the coroner. But again, a lot of counties are going to a combination of sheriff / coroner in some respects to reduce cost and organizational administration and things such as that. Then you have justice of the peace, which is also has its roots in England. It's a minor justice official who oversees lesser criminal trials. One of the early English judicial functionaries, can be traced back to as early as 1195 in England. And early justice of the peace justices were landholders, so people that have some level of influence and authority. Many states have done away with justice of the peace type positions, although you will find them a lot in the northeast part of the country. They still have justice of the peace courts. And again, they tend to handle relatively minor type infractions that occur within the community. So all of these concepts, the sheriff, constable, coroner, justice of the peace, they all have a history in England, so and our colonial roots. So a lot of these things that the founding fathers continued were carried over when they came here from England. Now, The police reform in England began in about 1829, and this is where we get into Sir Robert Peel. Now, during that period of time, workers protested against new machines, food riots, and an ongoing increase in crime. And a lot of this was a result of industrialization. So we began to see much increase in worker violence and protests and things like that. General disturbance of the peace type issues. And the task was given to Sir Robert Peel to establish a police force to combat these problems. And he was able to convince Parliament in 1829 to pass the Metropolitan Police Act, which allowed the creation of the London Metropolitan Police. Now, Sir Robert Peel had his principles because he had to sell this concept of policing because it was foreign. It was foreign to England. They've never had that before, the idea of a police force separated from the military, those type of things. So he created his Peelian principles, and these principles were designed to ensure not only Parliament but the public of the role that the police would take. I'm not going to go through all of these as they will be part of my outline that you can read, but just know that some of these principles are still alive and well today. All right, so very forward-thinking part on Sir Robert Peel to create these Peelian principles, and as you read them, you will see that many of these are very applicable to law enforcement today. All right, so next we're going to talk briefly about policing comes to the United States. And in the United States, it took three different forms, the eras of policing. We start with the political era, which ran from the 1840s to the 1930s. Under the political era, much of the authority rested with politics, all right? So it's a period of time when police were tied closely to politics and politicians and were dependent on them for being hired, promoted, and their assignments. And it raised a lot of issues in terms of police corruption. In other words, merchants could pay the police to ignore certain things so that they can keep their businesses operating illegally. Maybe it was after-hours clubs or whatever the case might be. The primary function of law enforcement during that time was crime control, order maintenance, and broad social services. In other words, the police were involved in a lot of social services, such as feeding the poor, doing a lot of things today that we have non-governmental organizations handling, things like that. So those were part of the political era because obviously if the police were able to help the local politician keep his or her seat, then they were able to keep their jobs. Because typically if a new politician came in, then the old police of the prior political leader were fired and new ones were brought in that were more devoted to the new political leader, whoever that was. The organizational design of policing in that era was decentralized and geographical. Decentralized meaning that the authority really lied with the captain of a precinct in that particular geographical area. During the political era, a police chief or police commissioner was really just a figurehead. The precinct captains had more political clout and more authority than the police chief did. Okay, so that was a key part of that whole political era. The relationship to the public was close and personal because cops were walking the beat, cops were engaged in some social services, they were more designed for order maintenance, keeping the peace, those type of things, keeping the neighborhoods in line, things such as that. Now, in terms of demand, in other words, how did the public get their concerns taken care of? Basically, it was managed through links between politicians and precinct commanders and face-to-face contacts between citizen and foot patrol officers. So if a businessman had an issue, he might call his local political leader, his local council member, and that council member would then call the precinct commander and get the problem resolved. Now, there may have been a fee for such a service, but nonetheless, that's how that was done. A lot of technology that was used in that area was rather minimal, obviously. So basically, we're talking about foot patrol and rudimentary investigations. There's nothing complex about that. The outcome, political and citizen satisfaction with the social order. People seem to be satisfied. The corruption was there, but local issues got addressed by the police via their elected members. Since there was a lot of graft and corruption that took place during this period, the reform era slowly developed between the 1930s and 1980s. Police sought to extricate themselves from the shackles of politicians, leading to the crime fighter era. Reformers sought to reject political involvement by the police, which resulted in civil service systems were created to eliminate patronage and ward influences in hiring and firing. And then we began to see some profound leaders in criminal justice, specifically in law enforcement, such as August Vollmer, who ended up being the police chief in Berkeley, California, who began this whole idea of professionalizing police, having educated police officers, the use of technology to help solve crime. The idea of separating, if you will, police from politicians, and at the same time separating the police from the public to reduce that type of influence, not only from the politicians, but also from the public as well, because people thought the public was also corrupt in the fact that they tried to bribe police and those type of things. So we had the reform era. It was a period of using law professionalism. The primary function of the police during this era was crime control. The organizational design was centralized and classical. Centralized meaning the power lied in the central police commands or the police chief. So here, the power shifted from precinct commanders in the political era to the police chief. So it was centralized power, and it was classical organizational structure, chain of command, things like that. Rules and regulations. People did as they were told. And so that is basically a key to this idea of the reform era. And the relationship to the environment, police became professionally remote, all right? It was yes ma'am, no ma'am, what's the issue, what's the problem, let's get the problem solved. So it was professional, but it was remote. Police did not have that warm, cozy, face-to-face contact as was common with the political era, because we began to use technology in a different way. The automobile, for example, the police radio, for example. So it took a police officer off the neighborhood, walking a beat, into a radio car in which they were able to handle calls for services in a much more efficient manner. And in fact, the demand for police services, the way you sought and got the police to come to whatever the issue was channeled to a central dispatching services. So no longer did people go through their local politician to get a legal matter resolved. Now you call the police department, 911 or the business line. You tell them what your issue is, and they send a police officer out. And the police officer remains remotely professional, goes out, handles your call, handles the problem, moves on. Remember, the focus was crime control. So take people to jail. So if you violate the law, you basically went to jail. That was the answer. All right, so the outcome again was crime control. Now, the final era was the community era or community policing era, which is what we're in right now, from the 1980s to the present. So it's a time when police retrained to work with the community to solve problems by looking at their underlying causes and developing tailored responses to those problems. So I'm going to take a stop right here. When I come back, we're going to talk about, finish talking about the community era, and then we're going to talk about the last couple of ideas relating to the rule of law. And so that should probably just take 5 or 10 minutes. All right, guys, so I'll see you in just a bit. Thank you.